Hello, I am John Mosman, and this is Beyond the Stone Table Podcast 2.0. You can find out more information about me and my podcast, and of course my other show that's premiering on January 18th, called Theologically Speaking, at my website, johnmosman.com. Hello, everyone. This is your host of the Beyond the Stone Table Podcast. I am John Mosman. I hope you all are having a good day or good night whenever you're listening to this. We appreciate everything you do and supporting this podcast. If you've not heard this podcast before, you might want to take the opportunity to take a rewind and listen to the previous podcast that we had, where I established things such as myth and fantasy. And you might ask yourself, why does one, such as myself, wish to go down this journey? Well, first of all, I've always been fascinated with storytelling. I've always been fascinated with myth. I've always been fascinated with things that tell us something that have a deeper truth that cannot always be conveyed with basic language or with facts, right? And so I established that in the previous episode that myth is something and it isn't something. And the first thing that I established that it wasn't is that it wasn't fantasy. And what I had said was that the difference between myth and fantasy is that, unlike fantasy, myth is based on certain truths, based on certain realities, based on something that is universal to most people in the world. Myth has a grounded reality. It takes you to the heart of something that you may not always want to confront. And it always usually shows a dilemma, and it always shows us something that we can rise to. Fantasy, on the other hand, is nothing but fluff. It is a departure from reality. It is something to indulge. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying I don't like fantasy literature. Of course, fantasy literature is one of my favorite genres. I'm not saying don't ever do fantasy. But especially when you're talking from a Christian perspective, it's always interesting because I've always heard, people say, you shouldn't like fantasy, you shouldn't like things. And I understood some of it, but I didn't understand why. And of course, especially with great Christian authors such as J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, who in many people's eyes would consider that fantasy. But then I realized that those works weren't fantasy. And this has an important message. This has an important meaning when we continue to go into other things that this podcast will cover. Because once we establish that you cannot say things about myth, that there are people who are confusing myth for fantasy, there are people who are confusing myth as something as being completely 100% unrealistic, unattainable, nothing found in reality, all of these things, well, then that becomes a problem. Especially when someone levels a claim, like I discussed in the previous episode, of when someone says Jesus is a myth, right? Well, that's not necessarily the best way of making the argument, which I think the argument they're making is that he's made up. He's a fantasy. He is completely untrue. And while fantasy departs, and fantasy has a lot of things that we like, the majority of what fantasy is contains things that don't make sense, that don't have any kind of context with reality. And this is important to understand because myth is not. And we have to establish, because if we're going to establish something here, we're going to establish that there's good myth, there's myth that tells us the story, the myth that tells us things, and then there's the fantasy, which indulges our fantasies, indulges things that we like. And also have unreasonable thoughts and unreasonable things. And while there are magical and creative things that happen in certain myth that we wouldn't necessarily see today in our daily lives, it's not necessarily used as saying it is real, but rather it is a device in which we speak of certain things. Now, of course, since we've talked about religion, don't ever confuse what I'm saying as saying that now I'm saying, well, because Jesus walked on water, that's just a device to tell us something. No, that did actually happen. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying here, okay? In fact, I got an email from my last podcast where someone thought that I was saying some things dangerously about saying Jesus is a myth or something. But what I was trying to convey is this idea that within the story of Jesus, there is the reality of Jesus, there is the truth and the facts of what Jesus did, that he existed, those things, but that the story, what that has, and what that story meant. Because for people like Tolkien, they understood the greater myth. And we're going to explore how this, in different ways in the future, when I get to that point, when I decide to want to get to that point, that's where I'll get to. But I want to say this. I want to make sure that it is clarified that I'm not trying to say something that I'm not, because that is important. I will give you an example, a good example of what fantasy is. If you've ever seen the movie, and it is a funny movie, I'm not dogging the movie, it's funny, although the sequels were not as good in my opinion, but The Hangover, funny movie, okay? But that is a true fantasy. More fantasy than Tolkien's world, right? More fantasy than most things like Harry Potter. In fact, I can remember telling someone that The Hangover was more of a fantasy than most fantasy films I've ever seen. And someone's like, what? How can that be? Well, of course, it takes place in Las Vegas, right? So it can't be a fantasy. We're thinking that fantasy only takes place in fantasy worlds. That's not necessarily true. And just because fantasy takes place in real worlds, and sometimes myths speak of worlds that aren't here anymore, it doesn't mean one or the other is not true or is true. But when you watch that movie, and if you haven't watched that movie, please, stop listening to this till you do. But I don't want to give out spoilers, but I think it's been some time, so hopefully I'm not giving out any spoilers. I'm not going to tell you who Kylo Ren is from Star Wars yet. But what is the fabric of what that movie's all about? Oh, it's all about things that would never happen in reality, like a tiger and losing a baby or finding a baby. I mean, things that they're over the top, and they're meant to be funny. They're meant to kind of say, this is like a couple of regular guys, 4 regular guys in a situation, right? But that's a fantasy. And the whole aim of that movie is to take you on this little journey, this little fantasy yarn, where for a couple hours we laugh at the improbable things that happen in that movie. Now, this should be understood as not being myth. It should be understood as not being something that is conveyed a lot of times in myth. For example, Tolkien's myth. You have war. You have people who are conflicted by what war means. You have characters who don't want to get involved in war. You've got characters who feel like war is the only option. You've got characters who are trying to make war. You have characters who are trying to stop war. Now, these are all things that, even though all this takes place in Tolkien's Middle-earth, there's context to it. Because there are wars in our world, and those are reasons and ideas that people have about war in Lord of the Rings are the same things that we see today. In fact, I always say this, that Lord of the Rings is more of a war story than it is anything else. Okay, but we're going to go past that, because I'm short on time, and I don't want to continue talking about the differences between myth and fantasy. What I do want to talk about is that we've established that, so we can start putting ourselves into things. Now, once we've established that myth isn't fantasy, and that myth can be true, it can have truth to it, where do we go from here? Well, we know there's different types of myth out there that ring true. And when I said last time about Jesus being that, is that he embodies a mythical archetype for a story. In fact, I would argue that most stories that we see today reflect that. You have, in a lot of stories, the hero's journey, right? Now, for those who are familiar, who are especially around, I wasn't, but of course, being a huge Star Wars nerd, I read up on it and watched documentaries on George Lucas being inspired by Joseph Campbell. But those who are, who were around in the 70s and the 60s know who Joseph Campbell was. He was a philosopher / mythologist, professor of mythology. And he talked about, a hero. He had a book called A Hero of a Thousand Faces, saying they're basically different faces, but they're the same type of character, which is the hero, and all these kinds of things. And things that he says that I think are true, dead on, but there's things that he comes up with that are completely far-fetched, completely out of it. I would say, because he says that Jesus is a myth that fits in that motif, but what I would say is that Jesus is the standard that many motifs have been set around. Like, if you watch a lot of movies, if you read a lot of books, right, you always see the hero starts off is a reluctant hero. Majority of heroes that you see in books and movies are reluctant heroes. They don't want to go. Perfect example, Bilbo Baggins in The Hobbit, right? He doesn't want to leave the Shire. He doesn't want to leave his hole. He wants to be in content. He wants to be where he wants. And that is something that that happens. Now, obviously there are heroes who feel the need to do something, and his nephew, Frodo, is someone who is compelled to do something even if he doesn't want to do it. Those are similar things, obviously. Okay? But then you usually have the hero who goes on a journey, and usually after this journey he finds himself in conflict, and he has to go underground. There's this idea of the hero going under and then rising. Well, where do we know that from? Jesus. But it's surprising if you look at a lot of movies. And I'm not just talking about the fantasy epics like Lord of the Rings, which is actually myth epics, but I'm talking about also movies like First Blood. Have you ever seen First Blood with Sylvester Stallone, the very first Rambo movie, where he's being chased, he goes up the mountain and he goes into the mine, right? He goes under after he's been shot, and he's at his low point, and he's about to come out. I mean, this is nothing that's not new. This is something, if you really pay attention, boys and girls, you'll see this happening over and over. These things do occur. Myth is a way to tell these kinds of stories, a way to tell something. And that is what's important to establish. Because there is an element of the story that we have of Jesus that defies many things that we think about in our reality, in our day-to-day life, right? Things that we would not think of. But his story is there, beckoning us, calling us, and transforming us. But it's not just the story itself that does it. Of course, it's the response to that story, the believing in that story. It's important, if we continue to go down this path of talking about myth, is understanding something that one of my favorite writers, G.K. Chesterton, said. And that he said that fairy tales are true, not because a dragon exists, because it says dragons exist, but that dragons can be beaten. And that things can be overcome. That's what he talks about. He's talking about that the fantasy, the fairy tale, is something that, not the fantasy, but the fairy tale tells us, the myth tells us that heroes rise and that things can be defeated. This reflects the most greatest story in the world. That is Jesus Christ, who defeated the most powerful things out there. Death, Satan, but first and most importantly, our selfish pride and our sin. He took it on himself and ye overcome it. And it is in myth that we can appreciate the sacrifice, the passion. We can appreciate the truth that resides within who Jesus was, who Jesus is, and what he did for you. And while I want to talk about myth, and I want to talk about what these things are, and I won't always talk about myth, but it's a framework, it's a fabric of what this podcast is all about. Same with understanding Jesus. For the Beyond the Stone Table podcast, I am your host, John Mosman. Don't forget, January 18th, I am doing my new show, Theologically Speaking, with Chad L. Bird. We're going to talk about the Old Testament, dual covenant theology. Thank you for listening. Good day. Stay safe. And good.